The shuttle doors opened like the lid of a freezer and exhaled a breath so sharp it tasted metallic, and the class stepped out onto Thrixis, as if onto the unlit side of a planet-sized knife. Snow was not soft here. It was a field of glass ground down to powder by centuries of wind, sculpted into ridges that cut boots and scraped plates with a rising hiss. The heads-up display in each cadet's visor turned the world into blue-white numbers. -60, gusts to 110, humidity deceptive under a sky that pretended to be clear but hid streamers of blown ice so fine they looked like smoke. An instructor's voice rasped over the channel with clipped formality, assigning beacons and radii of operation, counting out the hours and the penalties as if the terms could keep anyone warm. The human cadet listened without answering. She did not need a lecture to feel the way the wind moved and the way it would move again, carving, piling, striking, retreating, the rhythm of a predator that never slept. She watched how the snow grains bounced in sheets along the surface, how the sastrugi slanted in one dominant direction and then kinked where a cross gale nested in the land's hollow. She marked those kinks the way a sailor reads chop lines for shoals. A crystalline Altarian named Saren stepped beside her, and the air around Saren cracked with hairline fractures that sang when the wind tugged at the edges. Saren's species handled vacuum well, but surrendered heat too fast in atmospheres like this. A Corvan called Hrek tramped past with the stubborn gait of an arthropod who trusted mass over finesse, the joints of his external armor stiffening with frost in delicate rings that looked decorative until a hinge squealed under strain. A Remnari infiltrator, glassy and colorless, moved like a candle flame blown sideways by a breath, wearing a coat that shimmered with embedded resonance coils. He kept his eyes on the instructors and not on the horizon where the light was already bleaching out of the day. She kept her eyes on the horizon. The assignment was written in language borrowed from academics and insurance adjusters: 72 hours, low-tech protocols, preserve core temperature, maintain beacon contact, survey, and report. But the truth was older: survive. The human cadet flexed her fingers in her gloves and listened to the way the inside of the glove squeaked against the lining. The noise told her the fabric was dry. Good. The first hour, every species relied on what had always worked for them. Saren extended micro-fracture-absorbing lattices along her arms and tried to trap solar gain in the lattice like a lizard on a rock. The light on Thrixis had strength, but gave no warmth to bodies that bled it through every glittering seam. Hrek planted a tripod shelter with anchors drilled into the ice as if he meant to hold the sky down by brute force. The gusts flexed the struts and made them hum like a mouth harp, a sound that promised fatigue failure. The Remnari cadet tuned his coat to a frequency that sloshed heat across his skin in waves, the pulses visible as a faint ripple in the air around his shoulders. But each pulse stole power from a battery that did not like the cold. A Zephyrian pair loitered beside their sled, each long limb twitching under an iridescent film that had worked on their homeworld's dry winters. But here the film took on frost and stiffened until each step cracked it into glittering scales that poured away and exposed naked joints to the wind. An instructor walked the line with a clipboard purely for ceremony and glanced at the human as if to see whether she would break first or last. She looked past him at the snowdrifts feathered along the leeward sides of basalt lumps. The drifts were not just piles. The top skin was wind-hardened, the underneath was sugar, and between those layers ran a plane that could be cut. Her mind measured volumes without effort, the way a carpenter measures a board by sight. Warmth exists in geometry, she thought, not in gadgets. She said nothing on the channel and saved her breath for the hours that mattered. By the second hour, the wind changed pitch with the descending sun, and the temperature buckled, a quick drop like a trapdoor. The air made a brittle chime against Saren's forearm as a microfracture healed poorly and reopened, scattering tiny shards that skittered over the ice like dry leaves. Hrek cursed in his own language when one shelter hinge seized. He hammered it loose with the side of his glove and lost sensation in 3 fingers. The Remnari cadet toggled his coat higher, and the power gauge drained with the accelerating calm of a fatal decision. The Zephyrians backed their sled into the wind to make a partial windbreak, and then discovered that the sled's frame emitted a high, chaotic squeal when tortured by gusts, a sound that turned instinct into nausea. She walked a slow circle around her beacon radius and let the wind push her sideways while she studied how it lofted spindrift into curls along a particular ridge. The ridge had a gentle backslope and a sharp lee, and the lee side had drifted into a cornice with a clean underside. She did not yet imagine the shelter. She confirmed that the substrate beneath the drift was not a void and that the drift was deep enough to hold a hollow without thinning to daylight. She scuffed the surface with her boot and watched the grains lock or slither. Locked grains would hold a dome if she cut it right. Slithering grains needed compaction first. She filed the facts where she kept things she intended to use but not announce. The third hour convinced the overconfident to spend energy they would want later. Someone launched a microburner to preheat a fabric tent, and the flame went blue and narrow and ate fuel as if hungry for a proof of concept. Someone else tried to fuse an ice wall by melting the surface into a glass, and the glass cracked at once and threw off knife-edged flakes that cut the fabric that had just been preheated. A few cadets clustered around the instructor as if proximity to authority created warmth by implication. The instructor's mask hid his expression, but not his posture, which had acquired the impatient set of a man who knew that a lesson would be learned whether he framed it or not. The human cadet knelt to test the top crust of the drift with a gloved knuckle. It rang faintly like a ceramic bowl. Good. She rose before the sound of the wind, and before the sight of the horizon could seduce her into watching the way the light went purple, then gray, then the hard blue of oncoming night. She slid her pack's straps against her shoulders to keep the padding where she wanted it if she needed to crawl. She loosened the strap on her small shovel, not because the shovel would be enough, but because it would help her start in the right way and conserve the skin on her knuckles. She looked at Saren again and at the way Saren's jawline glimmered with internal light when a crack closed. Saren's pride had not yet accepted that pride would not keep blood from congealing. Rex's breath had gone shallow and fast and left white ghosts in the air that blew apart before the next arrived. The Remnari cadet's coat now pulsed at a frantic tempo, like a heartbeat sprinting downhill. The Zephyrians spoke to each other in a susurration like silk rubbed together, their voices full of arithmetic for power budgets that did not add up to dawn. The fourth hour delivered the first failures. The preheated tent collapsed under a gust that hit it like a shoulder charge. The fused wall lost a panel the size of a lid and clanged downwind until it shattered. A battery died with abrupt honesty, the readout flipping to flatline without even the courtesy of a last warning. The Remnari cadet stared at the number as if enough staring could raise it. The instructor's clipboard recorded nothing because the ink froze in the pen. He tucked the pen into his armpit, a human reflex, and then remembered that no human would ask him for notes while the night arrived with teeth. The human cadet watched the snow plume from the ridge like smoke from a chimney and mapped eddies by the way powder drifted and fell again. She had learned long ago that wind writes legible script if a person looks with the right kind of patience. She ate one mouthful of a high-fat ration and swallowed without tasting it. She breathed through the scarf inside the mask to warm the air an extra degree. She adjusted her goggles to cut glare without losing contrast, because contrast was the difference between a drift that would hold and a drift that would suffocate. Her body spoke to her in numbers of its own, how the sweat along her spine was threatening to chill, how the skin along her cheeks stung less now, and that was not good, how her fingertips felt thick and clumsy inside the gloves, how her calves were beginning to chatter in little tremors that wanted to grow into something that would use fuel she could not afford. She bent and scuffed a mark into the upwind face of the drift, a sign only she would read later when the light was gone. The fifth hour, dusk flattened the world. Shadows dissolved rather than lengthened, and the surface took on a uniform blue that hid edges. The cadets who trusted instruments turned their visors brighter and saw less. The cadets who trusted muscle tried to keep moving and bled heat into the winter's mouth. Saren's forearm cracked again with a sound like a bell under snow, and her face set into a diamond-hard determination that was admirable and that did not create a single calorie. Rek abandoned his shelter to the wind's argument and began stacking blocks of drift ice into a half-wall in a pattern he must have learned on a world where wind obeyed different rules. The wall shed vortices into his own camp and stole heat with each curl. The Remnari cadet turned his coat down at last, but the shock of the new cold made him gasp, and that gasp let in air so sharp it made him cough until he bent double, and the cough took more heat away. The Zephyrians climbed onto the sled to get their feet off the radiative sink of the ice and discovered that the sled was colder. The instructor called for status checks by number and rank and kept his voice even. She answered with her number and nothing else. Her words ghosted inside her mask and fogged the inner lens, and she wiped it with a slow fingertip, then remembered to slow her breath. She looked at the ridge and at the leeward face, and at the faint convex curve that said the drift had compacted under its own weight. She pictured the volume she could take and the volume she must leave, the thickness of a dome and the way an entrance tunnel must slope to trap the spill of cold air. She pictured the ceiling smoothed to stop drips and the floor raised with whatever brush this world would grudgingly offer. She pictured where the lantern would hang and how much ventilation to leave so carbon dioxide would not settle and turn the cave into a trap. She pictured all of it and did none of it yet. It was not time. The 6th hour, the world became sound and touch more than sight. The wind acquired a whistle that rose and fell like a saw. It dug at the ears and made thought stumble unless thought had been anchored beforehand. The ice underfoot squeaked on some steps and moaned on others, and the difference told an attentive body where the crust thickened or thinned. Her steps grew smaller because small steps use less heat and trip less often, and because she needed to feel the map under the surface through the soles of her boots. She passed within arm's length of Saren and saw through frost the lines of stress in Saren's cheek, where the crystalline plates met softer tissue. Saren did not ask for help, because Saren had never been the person in a group who asked first, and pride is a form of insulation until it is not. Rek's breath steamed through the gap where his mask met his mandible and froze there in a rim that looked like chalk. He shook his hands once, twice, the reflex of someone who had chopped wood in a cold dawn somewhere long before he learned to speak to a visor. The Remnari cadet looked at the instructor again with the eyes of a man who wanted orders and felt abandoned by strategy, then looked away when he realized no order would arrive that would bend the weather. The Zephyrians wrapped their long limbs around the sled stanchions and hummed a low chord designed to slow metabolic rate. The cord fluttered when the wind struck it and went ragged. She knelt again by the drift and dug a finger into the surface. The skin of the drift was firmer now. The temperature had dropped enough to lock the matrix. She pushed her finger in and felt the give underneath. The line between crust and sugar was sharp. The wind hissed over the top and spat powder into the air so fine it found every seam. She listened to the hiss the way a cook listens to a pan to know when to turn the heat down. The instructor's voice came on the channel with a reminder that each cadet must remain within the beacon radius, that penalties would be assessed for unauthorized shelter linkages, that this was a test of individual protocols as well as group coordination. The words went into the wind and came back thinner. She switched her channel to a lower volume. She did not argue with rules while a storm chose whether to keep her. She held one more breath under her tongue and let it out slow so the moisture would not spike and freeze inside the mask's corners. Night settled. The stars on Thrixis did not twinkle. The air was too clean for that. The constellations looked like a mechanism drawn on an engineer's slate, hard lines connecting hard points. She counted 3 familiar asterisms by habit and felt the small click of relief any navigator feels when the sky says her map is right. The map on the ground mattered more. She stood, shook her arms once to move warm blood from core to elbow, and made the decision she had been preparing all afternoon while others argued with equipment. She walked to the drift with her shovel loose in her hand and placed her first cut in the upwind face, low, shallow, precise, where the crust would slide rather than fracture. The sound the snow made when the blade entered told her what the night would allow. The first real crisis came not with the snow itself, but with the night that wrapped around it. Darkness on Thrixis was not a gentle dimming. It was a complete erasure of the horizon, as if someone had tipped an ink vat across the sky and drowned every outline in one stroke. The temperature plummeted in step with the disappearance of light, and the alien cadets who had been standing firm began to unravel. What discipline had held them upright gave way to instincts, and instincts in this cold were poor guides. A crystalline Altarian named Seren had endured the wind with rigid posture for hours, but when the air grew sharper than shattered glass, she finally faltered. The cracks along her arms, hairline at first, spread into glowing fractures that pulsed like veins filled with frostfire. She pressed her hands to her sides to contain the stress, but each movement worsened the fissures, and the sound of them resembled bells breaking underwater. Panic crept into her expression, though she tried to mask it under the pride of her species. A Corvan called Hrek, heavy-bodied and armored by nature, was the next to struggle. He had relied on strength alone to bear the weight of the storm, yet now his own plates betrayed him. The joints of his exoskeleton, which were supposed to lock tight, froze solid. Each attempt to flex his mandibles or claws produced a squeal of frozen hinges, sharp and grating, like metal bending beyond its limit. He tried to hammer his own joints loose with clenched fists, but each strike made the plates ring hollow, as if warning him that a fracture might finish the job. His movements slowed until the great insectoid warrior appeared less like a fighter and more like a statue abandoned in an Arctic museum. The Remnari infiltrator, a thin figure with translucent skin, was undone in another way. His heat-manipulating coat, tuned to pulse warmth in steady waves, began to falter. At first the pulses weakened, then they came in frantic bursts, then stopped entirely. Without the artificial rhythm of warmth, his body reacted with shivering so violent it shook the entire frame of his coat. He clutched his arms tight to his chest, gasping as each lungful of air stabbed into him like needles dipped in acid. His once fluid grace was reduced to the awkward jerks of a body trying to remember how to move. The Zephyrian pair were no stronger in the dark. They had been confident when their shimmering films caught what little warmth the day offered, but once the true cold fell, the iridescence stiffened into brittle scales. Each motion cracked another section free until their limbs glittered like broken mirrors. Desperation overtook them, and they pressed themselves against their sled for protection. But the sled was colder than the air around it, and instead of safety, it stole more heat from them. They began humming a resonance meant to calm their bodies, but the sound faltered under the cutting wind, turning into a quivering, frightened tune that betrayed more weakness than strength. The atmosphere among the cadets shifted from bravado to fear. No longer did anyone boast about endurance or speak of homeworld winters tougher than this. Each cadet realized that the test was no longer academic. It was survival stripped to its core. Whispers broke the silence, nervous mutterings carried across the comms channel. Some begged instructors for clarification. Others cursed the academy for cruelty. A few accused the storm of being unnatural, as if the planet itself was alive and hunting them. All of them searched for direction, for someone to tell them the suffering would end if they simply endured a little longer. But no promise came, and the cold did not stop to consider their panic. The human cadet observed all of this without joining the panic. She stood apart, watching how one after another succumbed to the creeping claws of hypothermia. Her breath was measured. The rhythm of someone who had accepted that control came from small decisions. She tightened her scarf inside the mask, drew her coat closer, and deliberately slowed her heartbeat. Her training was not in ignoring fear, but in bending it into focus. While the aliens cried out over channels or shook in silence, she kept her thoughts fixed on survival steps. Yet the collapse of discipline around her was impossible to ignore. Saren, despite pride, began speaking louder, voice cracking with fear that matched the lines across her crystalline form. She called for someone to help brace her arms, for some device to reinforce her failing lattice. No one moved to answer her because no one had the energy or courage to do so. Rek finally fell to his knees with a crash that made the ice beneath him groan. He attempted to rise, but his limbs betrayed him, stiff and slow, and his body seemed to sink under the weight of the armor that once defined his strength. The Remnari cadet curled into a ball, clutching his coat as if squeezing it would force warmth back into existence. His translucent frame trembled violently, and condensation froze against his face in white streaks. He began muttering incoherently, words slurring into fragments that made no sense even in his native tongue. The Zephyrians clung to one another, their brittle scales breaking off with each desperate movement, falling to the snow like shards of colored glass. Their humming turned frantic, almost a sob, an admission that their strategy had failed. Fear spread like wildfire through the group. Cadets who had trained for years in strategy and tactics, who had memorized endless manuals of survival, were reduced to frightened beings huddling in the dark. The storm had stripped away technology, pride, and discipline, leaving them raw and exposed. The test had transformed from an exercise into a nightmarish trial, and many knew deep down that dawn might not come for them. She watched this unraveling with grim clarity. She had expected it. She had known that survival was not about who had the most advanced gear or the strongest body, but who could keep calm when everything collapsed. She saw now that the cadets were unraveling faster than the storm itself, and that she alone still had control. Panic, she knew, was a killer more merciless than frost. She measured the time by the faint rhythm of her breath inside her scarf and the way her goggles frosted at the corners. The night had only begun, and the cadets were already losing the fight. It was in this chaos that her resolve hardened. She realized she could not waste energy trying to comfort or calm them now. Words would not thaw frozen limbs or heal fractured pride. She would need to act differently, to build something real that could outlast the storm. The panic of the others only made her conviction stronger. While the others cried, cracked, or collapsed, she lowered her eyes to the snowdrift she had marked earlier. The cadets were too lost in their fear to notice what she was preparing. The night might take them all if nothing changed, but she already had the beginnings of a plan. And unlike the others, she trusted not in technology or tradition, but in her hands, her will, and the snow itself. She began her work with deliberate calm, even as the storm howled around her and the cadets near her struggled to keep their own bodies from failing. The snowdrift she had chosen earlier stood like a small wall in the wasteland, its slope thick with compressed layers that would hold together if shaped carefully. She pulled her small shovel from its strap and drove the blade into the crust. The sound of the first cut was different from the brittle squeals of the wind. It was muffled, heavy, almost soft, and it told her exactly what she needed to know. The snow here was dense enough to carve, but not so hard that it would collapse in chunks. She set to work with steady movements, keeping her body low so the gale did not rip the tool from her hands. Each stroke was measured. She was not digging recklessly, but sculpting, carving a hollow that would soon protect her from the cold. Her gloves stiffened as frost clung to them, but she ignored the discomfort. She knew that her hands were her most valuable tools, and she protected them with care. She scraped away layer after layer, making sure to keep the ceiling rounded, for she understood that a dome would bear weight far better than a flat roof. She had no instruments to confirm her calculations, but instinct and memory guided her. She remembered how heat rises, how moisture condenses on uneven surfaces, and how drips of melting frost could kill warmth as quickly as open air. She worked in silence, the rhythm of her shovel blending with the howl of the wind, while behind her the other cadets still muttered or whimpered, too consumed by fear to notice that one of them had already begun solving the problem. The entrance was crucial. She carved it low and narrow, forcing herself to crawl in and out on her stomach. Each time she slid back into the open air, the storm clawed at her with icy fingers, but she never allowed herself to hesitate. The tunnel sloped downward before rising into the chamber she was shaping, ensuring that the coldest air would sink and stay trapped at the bottom while the interior retained the warmth of her body. She smoothed the walls with her palms, pressing the snow until it compacted, sealing it into a hard, glistening shell. Her breath fogged inside the hollow, and for the first time that night she felt the air around her lose its bite. The difference was slight, but it was a sign of what would come. The storm roared harder outside, testing the integrity of her work. Snow whirled past the entrance, filling the air with a blinding curtain of white. Yet inside the hollow, the sound was muted, the air still. She paused to listen, feeling the vibrations of the wind against the dome, but knowing the structure was strong enough to withstand it. She took a moment to flex her shoulders, then crawled back out into the open to gather what little the barren ice moon offered. She found brittle branches from low shrubs buried beneath drifts and snapped them apart with quick strikes of her boot. These she carried into the shelter, laying them across the floor so her body would not rest directly against the freezing ground. Her movements attracted attention. Rek lifted his head from where he knelt, his mandibles clicking in disbelief. He squinted through the ice clinging to his mask, watching as she disappeared into the snowdrift again. Saren, her glowing fractures spreading, turned her head with difficulty, the faint light from her body casting eerie shadows across the storm. The Remnari cadets shivering slowed for a brief moment as he noticed her calm persistence, though his body still betrayed him with violent tremors. The Zephyrians, huddled together against their sled, raised their brittle faces, their scales falling in flakes as they tried to understand what the human was doing. None of them spoke to her, for speech seemed useless in the gale, but in their eyes a flicker of something stirred, curiosity mixed with desperation. She ignored their stares. Her focus was entirely on the shelter, on making sure it would not only hold, but keep her alive through the night. She carved shelves into the walls where she could place her small lantern and her rations. She kept the ceiling smooth, pressing it until no jagged pieces hung down that could drip as warmth began to build. The chamber grew large enough for her to sit up, though she kept it compact to conserve heat. Every choice she made was precise, born from knowledge rather than guesswork. When she finally lit her small lantern inside, the transformation was immediate. The flame flickered weakly at first, but within minutes the interior grew warmer, the icy air softening to a tolerable chill. The walls glistened with faint moisture, but the dome was strong, holding the heat without collapsing. She exhaled and allowed herself the smallest of smiles, though she quickly suppressed it. Survival was not about celebration, it was about discipline. Still, the sense of control gave her strength she would need for what came next. Outside, panic deepened among the cadets. The Altarian's glowing fractures threatened to split her arms apart. Rek had frozen nearly solid, his great frame stiff and clumsy. The Remnari curled tighter into himself, his coat now useless. The Zephyrians trembled against one another, their humming now a desperate whine. The human's shelter, though still small and incomplete, shone faintly in the dark from the glow of her lantern. For the others, it was a beacon, a sign that one among them had not surrendered to fear or the storm. Some of them began to crawl toward it, drawn not only by the light, but by the instinctive recognition of safety. She heard their movements outside, the crunch of frozen limbs dragging across the snow, and she tightened her grip on her shovel. She had built the shelter for herself, but now she realized it might become more than her refuge. She weighed her options in silence, staring at the rounded walls she had shaped with her own hands. The storm was merciless, and the night was far from over. If the others tried to enter, the dome might crack under the weight of too many bodies, yet to refuse them would mean their certain death. Her lantern flickered, casting shadows across her face. She listened to the muffled cries outside, the broken voices of cadets who once mocked her, now begging for something they could not build themselves. Her decision would shape not only her own survival, but theirs. For now, she remained inside, resting her back against the wall she had carved, conserving her strength. The storm raged on, and the aliens outside shivered closer, their desperation growing with every minute. The human had created warmth where none should exist, and soon the others would test how much of it she was willing to share. The cries outside grew louder as the wind shifted and funneled down toward the drift where her shelter glowed faintly with the soft light of the lantern. The snow muffled the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Please, desperation, the edge of panic sharpened by the certainty of death. She sat inside the rounded chamber she had carved, her back pressed against the wall, listening with calm breaths. She had built the snow cave for herself, a shield against the storm, but she could not ignore the living bodies struggling just beyond the narrow tunnel. She set her shovel aside and pressed her hand against the cold wall, feeling the faint vibration of movement outside. For a long moment, she weighed the risks. The structure could collapse if too many crowded inside. Heat could be lost if the entrance remained open for long. But if she barred them entirely, their lives would end within hours, and their frozen corpses would be a reminder of what she chose not to do. Her instincts, sharpened by experience in harsh environments, urged her to conserve her strength, to prioritize survival above compassion. Yet another instinct, quieter but stubborn, told her that survival meant more than one life if she could prevent others from falling. She moved forward and crawled into the narrow tunnel, her body scraping against the compacted snow. The cold bit at her face as she pushed her way outside. At once, the storm slammed into her again, stealing her breath, clawing at her clothes, freezing the moisture in her scarf into brittle ice. Shapes emerged through the white veil, the crystalline Altarian, fractures glowing faintly across her body, leaning unsteadily as if each step might shatter her entirely. Hrek crouched low, his exoskeleton stiff, his mandibles grinding in pain as he tried to force his limbs forward. The Remnari cadet curled weakly on the ground, shivering so violently that snow sprayed with each tremor. The Zephyrians clung to each other, their limbs brittle and breaking, their eyes wide with terror. She motioned toward the tunnel, her gloved hand making a sharp gesture. The meaning was clear: enter, but carefully. Saren was the first to respond, crawling forward with difficulty. Her crystalline arms scraped against the tunnel's edge, but she forced herself through, collapsing inside the chamber with a choked gasp of relief. The glow from her fractures illuminated the walls with ghostly light. Hrek followed, his heavy form a greater risk. She braced herself as he squeezed into the tunnel, the snow groaning under his mass. For a moment she thought the dome would give way, but he managed to drag himself into the hollow, curling his large frame against the wall, his breathing shallow but steadying. She turned next to the Remnari, who had not moved. His body was almost translucent now, his coat drained of power, his skin pale with frostbite. She crouched and hooked her arms beneath his, hauling him upright with a grunt of effort. His limbs were light but uncooperative, flailing weakly as she dragged him toward the shelter. The tunnel scraped his shoulders, but she pushed until he slipped through, collapsing beside Hrek, his shivering body pressed against the warmth of the group. The Zephyrians hesitated, their eyes darting between her and the storm, as if unsure whether to trust a human solution over their own instincts. Another gust of wind howled, tearing scales from their bodies, and their decision was made. One after another they squeezed into the tunnel, their brittle limbs clattering against the walls until they stumbled inside, their long frames folding awkwardly in the confined space. The chamber filled quickly, the air heavy with labored breathing, the faint glow of the lantern mingling with the crystalline shimmer of Saren's body. Heat built almost immediately, the combined body warmth transforming the once frigid hollow into a space that, though cramped, felt survivable. She crawled in last, sealing the tunnel behind her with a block of snow cut earlier for this purpose. At once, the howl of the storm faded, leaving behind a muted silence broken only by the gasps of exhausted cadets. For the first time that night, there was stillness. The aliens shifted uncomfortably, pressing against one another in the tight quarters. Pride was gone. Survival had stripped them of dignity. Hrek's mandibles clicked softly as he tried to speak, but his words came out as a low rumble, his voice hoarse with fatigue. Saren leaned against the wall, her fractures dimming as warmth returned to her body. The Remnari cadet's shivering slowed, his translucent skin taking on a faint blush of color. The Zephyrians huddled together, their humming resuming at a softer pitch, a song of cautious relief rather than fear. She sat near the entrance, her body blocking the narrow tunnel. She knew the dome could only handle so much pressure, so she spread her arms against the walls, bracing it with her own body if needed. Her face was calm, her breaths even, though exhaustion tugged at her muscles. She let the silence linger, allowing the others to absorb what had just happened. Slowly, the realization spread among them that her crude shelter had saved them when their advanced technology had failed. Whispers began in the dark, soft at first, spoken in the languages of different species, but carrying the same message, gratitude mixed with disbelief. None of them had expected the human to be the one who solved the crisis. None of them had imagined that a simple snow cave, dug by bare hands and persistence, would succeed where energy shields and thermal coils had shattered. For the rest of the night, the cadets leaned into the warmth of the chamber. Some closed their eyes and slipped into uneasy sleep, their bodies finally allowed to rest. Others watched her silently, studying the calm on her face, the quiet authority in her posture. She did not speak, for words were unnecessary. The snow cave spoke for her, its walls holding back the storm, its air filled with the fragile warmth of life preserved against the cold. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, tearing across the ice moon with fury. But inside, within the dome she had carved, there was survival, and for the first time since nightfall, there was hope. Dawn came first, as a feeling inside the shelter, a loosening of the air that let chests expand without resistance, a faint thinning of the weight that had pressed on every rib all night. The lantern's flame seemed steadier, less embattled, and the frost that had edged the inner walls receded to a pearly sheen. She opened her eyes to a darkness turned gray and counted breaths, listening for the ragged rhythms that meant danger had crept back in while she slept. The chamber answered with slow inhales and measured exhales, a chorus of lives that had held through the worst hours. She reached up and cleared the vent with a gloved thumb, shaving away a film that had sealed in the humid air. The draft that returned was cold but honest, and the dome sighed as if relieved. She moved carefully among the cramped bodies without jarring the ceiling. Saren's fractures had dulled to faint lines, and the Altarian's posture had softened from rigid endurance into real rest. Hrek's plates no longer rang when he shifted. His hands flexed by degrees, and he rolled one wrist with the concentration of a smith testing a temper. The Remnari cadet had unwound from his tight curl. His coat lay slack over a chest that rose more evenly, and the violent tremors had declined to occasional shudders that ebbed each time warmth circled the chamber. The Zephyrian pair had found a stable braid of limbs and breathed in a resonant pulse meant to reset exhausted muscles. She watched all of it without speaking, then slid to the shelves she had carved and set the morning ritual in motion. She melted snow in a small vessel above the lantern, careful to add fistfuls only after a base of liquid formed so the flame would not smother. She held a ration brick under her arm until it softened, then cut it into equal portions with the edge of her shovel and passed the segments hand to hand. No one protested at the division. Hunger had been tamed by survival into obedience. She doctored the water with a pinch of salt and dissolved fat scraped from the brick, turning it into crude broth. Hrek accepted his share and cradled it between cupped palms to warm the joints of his fingers before he drank. Saren tilted the cup and let the steam bathe the fine lattice at the corners of her mouth, closing her eyes when the stiffness there eased. The Remnari cadet sipped in tiny swallows that did not shock his gut. The Zephyrians held the liquid longer, inhaling the warmth before they took it in, using breath to harvest heat as their physiology preferred. She took her own last and studied the flame while she drank, gauging how much fuel the wick still held. When the cups were empty, she shifted to the entrance and pressed her ear to the snow block that sealed the tunnel. The blizzard's voice had changed. The roar of the night had fallen to a low animal grumble, and the tiny ticks and scrapes of spindrift against the plug told her the gusts had lost the barbed edges that cut film and skin. She eased the block into her lap and let a ribbon of light crawl into the chamber. The first beam dazzled all of them, polished by the tunnel into a spear, but it carried a promise the lantern could not. She blinked, set the block aside within reach, and slid headfirst into the passage, backing the way she had entered each time in the night. Her shoulders brushed the walls. The cold met her face and bit, but it no longer had teeth sharp enough to draw blood from the breath. Outside the tunnel, the world had become geometry again. The horizon had returned, hard and distant, and the sun made the ice plains flash in a way that could blind an unwary gaze. She kept her eyes slit and counted 3 breaths before she raised the goggles. The ridge still threw a clean shadow, and the eddies she had mapped under starlight now wrote themselves in daylight as gentle scroll-work in the drift's lee. She stood, stamped the crust to read its tone, and marked a path with shallow heel cuts toward a rock outcrop she had chosen as a windbreak for the first minutes outside. She freed a strap from her pack and tied it to the tunnel lip, then looped the other end around her waist. No one inside would be lost to a surprise gust while exiting. She crawled back in and spoke the plan in short sentences. She would go first and hold position at the outcrop. Each cadet would slide through the tunnel one by one, remain low, follow her heel marks, and press into the shadow of the rock before standing. No running, no broad gestures, no waste heat. When the group had assembled, she would test the beacons, and, failing that, build a signal the old way. Hrek nodded once with the small economy of a fighter who had used up his surplus words in other seasons. Saren drew her limbs under her with care and set her jaw. The Remnari cadet kept his eyes on her face, as if the steadiness written there could be borrowed. The Zephyrians adjusted the wrap of their long arms for crawl stance. She replaced the block loosely to keep heat while she positioned herself, then slid out again and took the knee in the shadow, body angled as windbreak. The line came in order. Saren emerged first, crystal plates catching the light like watered silk, then dimming as she tucked herself into the lee. Hrek dragged his bulk through the tunnel with a sound like a crate across ice, then found his feet at once and moved with surprising delicacy along the marked path. The Remnari cadet fumbled at the lip, and she reached back, caught his forearm, and guided him forward until his weight settled into the snow with control. The Zephyrians came together, long frames folding and unfolding in practiced concert, and curled in the rock's pocket as if poured. When the last head cleared the tunnel, she slid the plug into place to preserve the cave's integrity for later use, and turned to the next work. She retrieved the team beacon from Hrek's pack and tucked the battery pouch under her coat against her ribs. Warmth would wake the chemistry if anything could. While she waited, she shaped a reflective panel from a slab of hardpack she had fused with the lantern's heat during a lull in the night. She rubbed the surface with cloth until it took a dull polish, and then used the sun at a low angle to throw a tight, rhythmic flash toward the ridge where instructors were most likely to scan. Saren shifted her arm and angled a facet to double the blink. The Zephyrians hummed at a frequency known to carry far in this air, a tone the Academy used as an auxiliary distress marker. Hrek cupped his hands around the beacon when she passed it back, and the readout flickered, then steadied to a pale bar that gave him the grin of a man who had coaxed spark back into a fire. The response arrived not as a machine, but as a shadow crossing the plain, a narrow crawler cresting a distant swell, and then threading the troughs with the patience of a driver who had learned this ice the hard way. The crawler's mast carried an array that sniffed for heat, sound, and the faint logic of beacons dragged back from coma. It swung once toward a pile of drift where a different team had holed up and did not move again. The air at that site did not pulse with breath. She looked away and fixed her eyes on the approaching vehicle. The crawler slewed in behind the outcrop to spare them the wind when it arrived, and the instructor inside took a long moment before opening the hatch, as if to gather the words appropriate to the scene. He stepped down, scanned faces, counted intact limbs, and then looked past them at the dome, at the neat plug, at the path of heel marks that led here in tidy arcs that did not waste a calorie. He did not offer applause. He took out a recorder and asked for facts. She gave them. She described the drift structure, the entrance geometry, the ceiling smoothing, the ventilation maintenance, the floor insulation, the ration sequence, and the exit protocol. She spoke for exactly as long as the details required and did not embellish. When she finished, he walked to the dome with Rek and pressed a gloved palm to the wall, listening to the echo of his own weight, before nodding once to himself. The return to base was quiet. The crawler's tracks wrote 2 clean lines through the morning, and the wind began to erase them at once. Inside the cabin, the heater purred, and the scent of warmed fabric made the alien cadets drowsy with the first edge of true safety. Saren closed her eyes and let the engine's vibration knit the last fragile joins of her fractures. Rek flexed each hand and counted the clicks until none remained. The Remnari cadet loosened his coat for the first time and let the heat seep into his chest without stealing his breath. The Zephyrians tuned their hum down to a private chord that tasted of gratitude. She kept her gaze on the window, studying the way the light slid across the sastrugi, already teaching herself what she would do sooner next time, what she would change, which steps deserved to be ritual rather than improvisation. The debrief filled an afternoon and did not spare anyone's pride. The Academy posted the trial's outcomes in unadorned numbers on the main hall's screen. The line for her team read as a column of lives returned with minor injuries and no losses. The lines for 3 other teams carried asterisks that sent the hall into stillness. Instructors did not scold. They revised. The survival manual received a new section before sundown, written in the dry cadence of doctrine but carrying the shape of her hands. Snow shelter protocols entered the syllabus with diagrams of entrance slopes, rules for vents, thresholds for ceiling thickness, and cautions about moisture management. The heading named the method without naming her, as the Academy preferred, but no one in the hall missed the source. Respect found her in small acts rather than speeches. Saren intercepted her outside the hall and touched 2 fingers to her own brow in the Altarian formality reserved for architects and healers. Rek set a wrapped bundle on her tray in the mess and walked away. Inside, she found a tool he had honed until the edge sang, a blade sized for gloved hands, as if he had decided she should never again start a shelter with skin on snow. The Remnari cadet crossed the training yard without his coat powered and asked no favors, only met her eyes for a second in a silent admission that he owed breath to her discipline. The Zephyrian pair arranged a brief harmonic in the corridor when she passed, a sound that hung in the air like sunlight through water and made the day brighter for anyone who heard it. She slept that night in her bunk under civilized warmth and did not dream of the storm. In the morning she woke and ran the perimeter with the rest, breath steaming in a harmless cool that pretended at severity. On the way back, she paused by a practice field where new cadets clumsily packed snow into blocks under an instructor's eye. The instructor saw her and adjusted the angle of a novice's entrance tunnel by 2 degrees, then nodded toward her in a gesture that asked her to cut in if she wished. She did not. The lesson would hold without her voice. The dome on Thrixis would be gone by now, settled into the plain like the memory of a footprint. The lives it sheltered were present enough. The Academy's record closed the file with a concise statement that the Ice Moon trial had met objectives for resilience under technological failure and that field-adapted human protocols had proven valid for cross-species application. That was the official end. The true conclusion lived elsewhere, in the quiet inside a rounded chamber while a storm burned itself out, in the small, stubborn acts that convert knowledge into warmth. She kept the shovel within reach of her bunk and moved through the days with the unremarkable gait of someone who had learned again what mattered most. On a world of glittering cold, she had built a space for breath. The lesson was simple and final. In places that punish arrogance, judgment, and care are shelter, and shelter is enough.